Men of Iron, Chapter 22. And so ended Miles Falworth's boyhood. 3 years followed, during which he passed through the state which immediately follows boyhood in all men's lives, at times when they are neither lads nor grown men, but youths passing from the one to the other period, through what is often an uncouth and uncomfortable age. He had fancied, when he talked with Guskin in the ear, that he was to become a man all at once. He felt just then that he had forever done with boyish things. But that is not the way it happens in men's lives. Changes do not come so suddenly and swiftly as that, but little by little. For 3 or 4 days, maybe, he went his new way of life, filled with the great change that had come upon him. And then, now in this and now in that, he drifted back very much into old ways of boyish doings. As was said, one's young days do not end all at once, even when they are so sudden and sharply shaken. And Miles was no different from others. He had been stirred to the core by that first wondrous sight of the great and glorious life of manhood opening before him. But he had yet many a sport to enjoy, many a game to play, many a boisterous romp to riot in the dormitory, and many an expedition to make, to copse and spinnery and river on days when he was off duty, and when permission had been granted. Nevertheless, there was a great and vital change in his life, a change we hardly felt or realized. Even in resuming his old life, there was no longer the same vitality, the same zest, or the same enjoyment in all these things. It seemed as though they were no longer a part of himself. The savour had slowly gone from them, and by it was pleasanter to sit looking on at the sports and the games of younger lads than to take active part in them. The 3 years of his life that had thus passed had been very full mostly of work, grinding and monotonous, of training dull, dry, laborious. For Sir James Lee was a taskmaster as hard as iron, and seemingly as cold as the stone. For 2, perhaps for 3 weeks, Miles entered into his new exercises with all the enthusiasm that novelty brings. But these exercises hardly varied little from day to day, and soon they became a duty, and finally a hard and grinding task. In the earlier days of his castle life, he used to hate the dull monotony of the tri-weekly hacking at the pells, with a heavy broadsword, as he hated nothing else. But now, though he still had the exercise to perform, it was almost a relief from the heavy dullness of riding in the tilt yard and with shield and lance, couch, recover, and passat. But though now he had but little time for boyish plays and escapades, his life was not altogether without relaxation. Now and then he was permitted to drive in mock battle with other of the younger knights and bachelors in the paddock near the outer walls. It was still more welcome change in the routine of his life when, occasionally, he would break a light lance in the tilting court with Sir Everard Wilby, while Lord George, perhaps, and maybe 1 or 2 others of the Hal folk looked on. Then one gilded day, when Lord Dudley was visiting at Delvin, Miles ran a course with a heavier lance in the presence of the Earl, who came down to the tilt-yard with his guest to see the young novite ride, against Sir Everard. He did his best, and did it well. Lord Dudley praised his poise and courage, and Lord George, who was present, gave him an approving smile and nod. But the Earl of Mackworth only sat stroking his beard impassively, as was his custom. Miles would have given much to know his thoughts. In all these years Sir James Lee almost never gave an expression either of approbation or disapproval, except when Miles exhibited some carelessness or oversight. Then his words were sharp and harsh enough. More than once Miles' heart failed him, and bitter discouragement took possession of him. Then nothing but his building tenacity and stubbornness brought him out from the despondency of those dark hours. "Sir," he burst out one day, when his heart was heavy with some failure, "tell me, I beseech you, do I show any skill at all? Is it in me ever to make a worthy knight, fit to hold lance and sword with other men? Or am I only a dull, heavy block, worth naught of any good?" "You are a fool, sirrah," answered Sir James in his grimy voice. Think ye to learn all of knightly presence in a year and a half? Wait until you are ripe, and then I will tell you if ye are fit to couch a lance and ride a course with a right knight. Ah, ye are an old bear, muttered Miles to himself, as the one-eyed knight turned on his heel and strode away. Beshrew me if I show you not that I am as worthy to couch a lance as ye, one of these final days. However, during the last of the 3 years, the grinding routine of his training had not been quite so severe as at first. His exercises took more and more often out into the fields, and it was during this time of his knightly education that he sometimes rode against some of the castle knights in friendly battle with sword or lance or wooden mace. In these encounters he always held his own, and held it more than well, though, in his boyish simplicity. He was altogether unconscious of his own skill, address, and strength, and perhaps it was his very honest modesty that made him so popular and so heartily liked by all. He had by this time risen to the place of head squire, or chief bachelor, holding the same position that Walter Blunt had occupied when he himself had first come, a raw country boy, to Delvin. The lesser squires and pages fairly worshipped him as a hero, although they imposed upon his good nature. All took pride in his practice and knightly exercises, and fabulous tales were current among the young fry concerning his strength and skill. Yet although Miles was now at the head of his class, he did not, as other chief bachelors had done, take a leading position among the squires in the Earl's household service. Lord Mackworth, for his own good reasons, relegated him to the position of Lord George's especial attendant. Nevertheless, the Earl always distinguished himself from the other squires, giving him a cool nod whenever they met. Miles, upon his part, now that he had learned better to appreciate how much his lord had actually done for him, would have shed the last drop of blood in his veins for the head of the house of Beaumont. As for the two young ladies, he often saw them, and sometimes, even in the presence of the Earl, exchanged a few scant words with them, and Lord Mackworth neither forbade it nor seemed to notice it. Toward the Lady Anne he felt the steady, friendly regard of a lad for a girl older than himself. But toward the Lady Alice, now budding into ripe young womanhood, there lay deep in his heart a resolve some day to be her true knight in earnest, as he had been her knight in pretence in the time of boyhood, when he had so perilously climbed into the privy garden. In body and form he was now a man, and in thought and heart was quickly ripening to manhood. For, as was said before, men matured quickly in those days. He was a right comely youth, for the promise of his boyish body had been fulfilled in a tall, powerful, well-knit frame. His face was still round and boyish, but on cheek and chin and lip was the curl of adolescent beard, soft, yellow, and silky. His eyes were as blue as steel, and quick and sharp in glance as those of a hawk. As he walked, his arms swung from his broad, square shoulders, and his body swayed with pent-up strength, ready for action at any moment. If little Lady Alice, hearing much talk of his doings and of his promise in these later times, thought of him now and then, it was not to be wondered at. Such were the changes the 3 years had wrought, and from now the story of his manhood truly begins. Perhaps in all the history of Devlen Castle, even at this, the high tide of pride and greatness of the house of Beaumont, the most notable time was in the early autumn of the year 1411, when for 5 days King Henry the Fourth was entertained by the Earl of Mackworth. The king was at that time making a tour through certain of the Midland countries, and with him travelled the Comte de Vermas. The Count was the secret emissary of the Dauphin's faction in France, at the time in the very bitterest intensity of the struggle with the Duke of Burgundy, and had come to England seeking aid for his master. It was not the first time the royalty had visited Delvin. Once, in Earl Robert's stay, King Edward II had spent a week at the castle during the period of Scottish wars, but at that time it was little more than a military post, and was used by the king as such. Now the Beaumonts were the very flower of their prosperity, and preparations were made for the coming visit of royalty upon a scale of such magnificence and splendor as Earl Robert, or perhaps even King Edward himself, had never dreamed. For weeks the whole castle had been alive with folk hurrying hither and thither, and with the daily and almost hourly coming of pack-horses laden with bales and boxes from London. From morning to night one heard the ceaseless chip-chipping of the masons' hammers, and saw carriers of stone and mortar ascending and descending the ladders of the scaffolding that covered the faces of the great north hall. Within that part of the building was alive with the scraping of the carpenter's saws, the clattering of lumber, and the rapping and banging of hammers. The North Hall had been assigned as the lodging place for the king and his court, and St. George's Hall, as the older building adjoining it was called, had been set apart as the lodging of the Comte de Vermoise and the knights and gentlemen attendant upon him. The great North Hall had been very much altered and changed for the accommodation of the king and his entourage. A beautiful gallery of carved woodwork had been built within and across the south end of the room for the use of the ladies, who were to look down upon the ceremonies below. 2 additional windows had been cut through the wall and glazed, and passageways had been opened connecting the royal apartments beyond. In the bedchamber, a bed of carved wood and silver had been built into the wall, and been draped with hangings of pale blue and silver. A magnificent screen of wrought iron and carved wood had been erected around the couch. Rich and beautiful tapestries, brought from Italy and Flanders, were hung upon the walls. Cushions of velvet and silk, stuffed with down, covered benches and chairs. The floor of the hall was spread with mats of rushes, stained in various colors, and woven into curious patterns, and in the smaller rooms precious carpets of Arras were laid on the cold stones. All the cadets of the house had been assembled, and all the gentlemen in waiting, retainers and clients, and the castle seemed full to very overflowing, and the dormitory of the squires was used as a lodging place for many of lesser gentry. So at last, in the midst of this bustle of preparation, came the day of days when the king was to arrive. The day before, a courier had come bringing the news that he was lodging at Dunester Abbey overnight, and would make progress the next day to Delvin. That morning, as Miles was marshalling the pages and squires, and with the list of names in his hands, was striving to evolve some order out of the confusion, assigning the various individuals their special duties, thus to attend to the household, those to ride in the escort, one of the gentlemen of Lord George's household came, with an order for him to come immediately to the young nobleman's apartments. Miles hastily turned over his duties to Guskin and Wilkes, and then hurried after the messenger. He found Lord George in the antechamber, 3 gentlemen squires arming him in a magnificent suit of ribbed Milan steel. He greeted Miles with a nod and smile as the lad entered. "Sirrah," said he, "I have had a talk with Mackworth this morning concerning you, and have a mind to do you an honour in my poor way. How would ye like to ride today as my special squire of escort?" Miles flushed to the roots of his hair. "Oh, sir," he cried eagerly, "if I be not too ungainly for your purpose, no honour in all the world would be such joy to me as that." Lord George laughed. "A little matter pleases you hugely," said he, "but as to being ungainly, whoso says that if you belies you, Miles? You are not ungainly, sirrah, but that is not to the point. I have chosen for you for my equerry today. So make ye haste and don ye armour, and then come hither again, and Hollingwood will fit ye with a wreathed bassonet that I have, and a tunic embroidered with my arm and colour." When Miles had made his bow and left his patron, he flew across the quadrangle and burst into the armoury upon Goskin, whom he found still lingering there, chatting with 1 or 2 of the older bachelors. "What think ye, Francis?" he cried, wild with excitement. "An honour has been done me this day I could never have hoped to enjoy. Out of all the household, Lord George has chosen me, his equerry, for the day, to ride to meet the king. Come, hasten to help me to arm. Are ye not glad of this thing for my sake, Francis?" "Ay, glad am I indeed," cried Guskin, the generous friend. "Rather almost would I have this befall you than myself." And indeed he was hardly less jubilant than Miles over this honour. 5 minutes later he was busy arming him in the little room at the end of the dormitory which had been lately set apart for the use of the head bachelor. "And to think," he said, looking up as he kneeled, strapping the thigh-plates to his friend's legs, "that he should have chosen you before all others in the fine knights and lords and gentlemen of quality that are here." "Ay," said Miles, "it passes wonder. I know not he should so single me out for such an honour. It is strangely marvellous." "Nay," said Guskin, "there is no marvel in it. I know right well why he choose you. It is because he sees, as we all see, that ye are the stoutest and best skilled in arms, and most easy of carriage of any man in all this place." Miles laughed. "And if ye make sport of me," he said, "I'll rap your head with the dagger hilt. Ye are a silly fellow, Francis, to talk so. But tell me, have ye heard who rides with my lord?" "Oh, yea, I heard Wilkes say it was Sir James Lee." Ah, I am right glad of that, said Miles, for then he will show me what to do and how to bear myself. It frightened me to think what would happen should I make some mistake in my awkwardness. I think Lord George would never have me with him any more if I do anything amiss this day. Oh, never fear, said Guskin. You will not do anything too amiss. And now at last the Earl, Lord George, and all their escort were ready. Then the orders were given to horse, and bugles sounded, and away they all rode, with clashing of hoofs and ringing and jingling of armor, out under the dewy freshness of the early morning. The sant yellow sun of autumn blazing and flaming upon polished helmets and shields, and twinkling like sparks of fire upon spear points. Myles' heart thrilled within him for pure joy, and he swelled out his sturdy young breast with great draughts of the sweet fresh air that came singing across the sunny hilltops. Sir James Lee, who acted as the Earl's quarry for the day, rode at a little distance, and there was almost pathetic contrast between the grim, steadfast impassiveness of the tough old warrior and Myles's passionate exuberance of youth. At the head of the party rode the Earl and his brother side by side, each clad cap a pie in a suit of Milan armor, the cuirass of each covered with a velvet tunic embroidered in the silver and arms and quarterlings of the Beaumont. The Earl wore round his neck an SS collar, with a jewelled St. George hanging from it, and upon his head a visored bascinet, ornamented with wreath covered with black and yellow, red velvet, and glistening with jewels. Lord George, as was said before, was clad in a beautiful suit of ribbed Milan. It was rimmed with a thin thread of gold, and like his brother he wore a bascinet wreathed with the black and yellow velvet. Behind the two brothers and their equerries rode the rest in their proper order, knights, gentlemen, esquires, men-at-arms, to their number perhaps of 250, spears and lances aslant, and banners, pinions, and flags of black and yellow flooded in the warm September air. From the castle to the town they rode, and then across the bridge, and thence clattered up through the stony street, where people looked down upon them from the windows above, or crowded the fronts of the shops of the trader-men. Lusty cheers were shouted for the Earl, but the great lord rode staring ever straight before him, as unmoved as a stone. Then out of the towns they clattered, and away in a sweeping cloud of dust amongst the countryside. It was not until they had reached the windy top of Willoughby Castle, 10 miles away, that they met the king and his company. As the two parties approached to within 40 or 50 yards of one another, they stopped. As they came to halt, Myles observed that a gentleman dressed in a plain blue-gray riding habit, and sitting upon a beautiful white gelding, stood a little in advance of the rest of the party, and he knew that that must be the king. Then Sir James nodded to Myles, and leaping from his horse, flung the reins to one of the attendants. Myles himself did the same, and then, still following Sir James's lead, as he served Lord Mackworth, went forward and held Lord George's stirrup while he dismounted. The two noblemen quickly removed each other's bassinet, and Myles, holding the bridle rein of Lord George's horse with his left hand, took the helm in his right, resting it upon his hip. Then the two brothers walked forward bareheaded, the Earl a little in advance. Reaching the king, he stopped, bent his knee stiffly in the armored plates until it touched the ground. Thereupon the king reached him his hand, and the Earl, rising again, took it and set it to his lips. Then Lord George, advancing, kneeled as his brother had knelt, and to him also the king gave his hand. Myles could hear nothing, but he could see that a few words of greeting passed between the three, and then the king, turning, beckoned to a knight, who strode just behind him and a little in advance of the others of the troop. In answer, the knight rode forward. The king spoke a few words of introduction, and the stranger, ceremoniously drawing off his right gauntlet, clasped the hand, first of the Earl, and then of Lord George. Myles knew that he must be the Lord Comte de Vermans, of whom he had heard so much of late. A few moments of conversation followed, and then the king bowed slightly. The French nobleman instantly reined back his horse. An order was given, and the whole company moved forward, the two brothers walking upon either side of the king, the Earl lightly touching the bridle rein with his bare hand. With all this passing, the Earl of Macquarie's company had been drawn up in a double line along the roadside, leaving the way open to the other party. As the king reached the head of the troop, another halt followed when he spoke a few courteous words of greeting to some of the lesser nobles attendant upon the Earl, who he himself knew. In that little time he was within a few paces of Myles, who stood motionless as a statue, holding the bascinet and the bridle rein of the Lord George's horse. What Myles saw was a plain, rather stout man, with a face fat, smooth, and waxy, pale blue eyes, and baggy in the lids, clean shaven except for a mustache and a tuft covering lips and chin. Somehow he felt a deep disappointment. He had expected to see something lion-like, something quite regal, but instead the great King Henry was commonplace, fat, and quite unwholesome looking. It came to him with a sort of shock that, after all, the king was in no wise different from the other men. Meanwhile the Earl and his brother replaced their bascinet, and presented the whole party moved forward on their trip to Delvin.